So, Will, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me.
The election's coming up next month. My suburb is full of corflutes, mostly Liberals and Teals. Cost of living and energy is a huge policy issue. So many Australians are concerned about this. Household electricity bills have soared over the last few years. Research shows that people are paying around 300 to 500 more dollars a year on electricity. Could you maybe explain a little bit about why Australians are seeing this increase in electricity bills?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm really lucky that I'm an 18-year-old and I don't have to pay power bills because they have risen by so much. And I think when we have a look at what's going on in Australia, we're being promised cheaper power from renewables, yet the more renewables that enter our grid, prices keep on rising. And I think it's a contradiction which is showing the flaws in our current approach of 100% renewables. So for someone like me, I think we should have all clean energy options on the table, including nuclear power, and look to what the rest of the world is doing, which is having nuclear power in a balanced energy mix to help bring prices down, ensure energy security in the grid, and also ensure that we can also reduce emissions at the same time. So when I look at Australia currently, we've got huge number of challenges, whether it's keeping the economy and industry afloat, whether it's keeping power prices down, the lights on, emissions down, and we can't do that with renewables alone. So I'm really passionately advocating for nuclear power.
So, can you explain a little bit about what our current energy mix is and when renewables started coming into that?
So currently Australia has around 45% renewables in the grid. So there has been a lot of progress in terms of renewables investments going into the grid. Obviously, Australia has had a long history of having a coal-dominated grid, and it's really recently where the renewable uptake has risen quite dramatically. Now, at the same time, as this renewable uptake is rising, we're seeing higher power bills. We're seeing issues in regional communities with a lot of pushback against renewable projects. There's job concerns and concerns about the longevity of a lot of these regions. And then at the same time, we're not actually seeing real progress in terms of lowering emissions, and certainly not at the rate that is going to be needed if we want to be able to seriously combat climate change. So there has been progress in Australia. We do have something to take advantage of with renewables, but at the same time, there's a critical role for nuclear power, which has been untapped if we want to be able to solve all of these issues at the same time.
A bit of a basic question, perhaps, but for someone without an engineering or science background, what exactly is the grid and how does this mix work?
So obviously myself as well, I don't have a science and engineering background, so it's best to listen to the experts on this stuff. But the grid is one of the most complex machines in Australia and probably the Southern Hemisphere. Specifically, the National Electricity Market is the grid that covers most of Australia on the eastern coast, whether it's Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, my state of the ACT, Tasmania and South Australia, where it's an interconnected grid which connects the generators, whether they be coal-fired power plants, solar farms, wind farms, gas peaking plants, the storage and firming, including batteries, and it connects those generators with distribution lines which go to the communities where the power is being used. That power is then circulated through transmission lines to be able to send to individual homes or businesses. So it's a really complex machine which requires a lot of inputs. And I think what's becoming really clear is that with renewables, because they are less reliable, it's becoming increasingly more complex to be able to manage the grid. It's already a complex system, but when you don't have that certainty of supply because you can't always predict the weather, you can't always know when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, it creates a lot of unpredictability, which requires a lot more firming, whether that be through expensive batteries, pumped hydro, gas peaking, which is really the taboo side of the discussion around the energy transition. So it's a really complex issue we've got to solve. And at the same time, it's going to become increasingly more complex as we consider electrifying our society, whether it's with more electric cars, electrifying heavy industry, trying to,
AI?
AI with the data centers, which some predict will take 15% of Australia's power by 2030.
Wow, 15%.
Yeah, there's huge rising energy demands. Even AEMO, the Australian Electricity Market Operator, predicts that Australia's electricity demand could double by 2050. So we've not only got the issue of decarbonising and transitioning our current grid to renewables, but then there's an added challenge of then transitioning the new grid and implementing a completely new grid with 100% renewables as well. So, the energy transition was never easy, and it's surely showing that, the current approach is not working. So it's really critical we're looking at all of the options available to us.
A few questions. You mentioned this word firming and firming the grid. I've heard about this, but could you explain exactly what it is?
Yeah, so when sun isn't shining, wind isn't blowing, such as times, usually this is going to be times where there is actually a lot of energy demand. Say during nighttime, if we want to be able to get our power and the solar panels aren't working, how are we going to be able to get our power? And that therefore has to be filled in with technologies, which you could put under the umbrella of firming, whether it is batteries, whether it is pumped hydro storage, where water is pumped up at elevation when there is excess electricity available. And then when there's a shortfall of electricity to meet demand, that water then, funnels back down through turbines to create electricity to fill in that gap in supply. And finally, there's also technologies like gas peaking plants, which can ramp up and down quickly to be able to fill those gaps in demand when the renewables aren't working. Now, with renewables, it's a really major challenge because when you look at their capacity factors for something like solar panel or wind turbine, it's around 20 to 30%, which means that on average, they're producing the maximum capacity around 20 to 30% of the time. So when they're not producing their maximum capacity, that obviously means that you have to fill in the rest of what they're actually being able to do, which requires a lot of that firming. Now, there's huge challenges with a lot of these technologies, such as batteries. I think a lot of people imagine that we could just live off batteries. A lot of the time, the battery actual capacities will last for around 2 hours at maximum capacity when you actually look at how much they're able to generate and how much they're able to store. But in addition to that, there's huge challenges with technologies like pumped hydro. There's currently the Snowy Hydro 2 scheme, which is being developed, which I think is on track to take more than a decade and cost more than 10 billion Australian dollars. And then with gas peaking, gas is a fossil fuel. It doesn't solve the climate change challenge. So we can obviously all live in hope, but the issue we've got at the moment is not necessarily with renewables themselves, but all of the other things which have to go with the renewables grid to make it work, which is the really complex part of the energy transition, which is causing a lot of harm right now with impacting bills, impacting people's livelihoods, where a lot of this infrastructure is being developed. And I think it's something that needs to be discussed more.
So you've just mentioned Snowy Hydro and that it's probably going to take about a decade. People, when they talk about nuclear, critics of nuclear often talk about how long it takes and that we just don't have enough time. Yet, this hydro project is taking about 10 years. Why do you think there is more heavy criticism on nuclear compared to other forms of energy?
Well, to me, it makes no sense because nuclear isn't treated on a level playing field. There's all these questions you get about nuclear, like how much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? Where will the waste go? Has community been talked to? But if you ask those same questions about other energy technologies like fossil fuels or like renewables, they're often not asked. And that's caused a lot of detriment to a lot of people in Australia. Now, I think it's very reasonable that, nuclear is obviously a very different technology to solar panels, wind turbines, and fossil fuels. So there has to be more questions asked. Naturally, that is what actually happens. It's a highly regulated industry around the world. There's a lot of watchdogs in place, particularly with things like safety. But that's in the best interest of everyone's livelihoods. So nuclear is already heavily regulated. There's a lot of questions already asked of it. Yet, as you look around the world, it's a flourishing industry. There are currently 440 operable nuclear power plants around the world. 32 countries have nuclear power, 50 are looking to it for the first time. So we hear a lot of these questions in Australia, questioning the viability of it. But you only have to look around the world to see that nuclear is being used and is part of, a lot of countries' grids for the better. Now, in terms specifically of time frame, my question when I hear people say, but it will take too long is, what other choice do we have? The current firming technologies which are having to be installed for renewables also take an incredibly long time to be established, like those pumped hydro schemes I mentioned. And at the same time, they don't have a lot of benefit like a nuclear power plant provides, because during the time a nuclear power plant is being constructed, there are many, many jobs in construction which are high paying, unionized, and that supports and uplifts the communities where they're being established in, to then provide a long-term guaranteed source of reliable, low carbon, low cost power in these communities. Nuclear plants last anywhere from 60 years to even up to a century in some cases, is what people are currently envisioning. Now, in terms of how long it would take Australia, the current estimates from the International Atomic Energy Agency, which the government goes to for advice on nuclear, is 10 to 15 years for a new to nuclear country to be able to establish a nuclear power industry. But I think the important thing is Australia is not starting from scratch like a lot of countries. Now, the UAE was able to basically install a reactor from absolute scratch in around a decade. Australia, on the other hand, we've got the most uranium in the world. We've had experience for decades of operating multi-purpose reactors in Lucas Heights. We've currently got the Opal reactor in the suburbs of Sydney, producing life-saving nuclear medicines and important research. And in addition to that, we're currently skilling up a nuclear workforce for the AUKUS submarines. We're going to have floating small modular reactors going around major cities for our national security, yet we can't consider those same small modular reactors on land for our energy security. So, Australia's already got a really good place to start. We've also got a nuclear regulator. We've got a lot of the things in place that we need. So, like I said, we don't really have another choice, but the important thing is if we fully committed to it and our politicians got over their fear campaigns and got over their ideological opposition to nuclear, it's something that we could establish quickly and efficiently.
Can you explain what a small modular reactor is, and does it look like the Simpsons sort of reactors, or is it different?
Yeah, so there's multiple kinds of nuclear reactors. With solar, wind, or other technologies, a coal plant looks like a coal plant. A solar panel, they all look the same. Same with wind turbines, they all look the same. They might be different sizes. But with nuclear power, there are so many different kinds of nuclear power plants, whether it's with different fuels, with different size plants producing different amounts of electricity, or whether it's with different coolants. There's all of these different options available. If you don't like a particular kind of nuclear power plant, you can build another. Now, in terms of the size of reactors, you get into basically a scheme where you've either got large reactors, which is commonplace around the world. We're talking around gigawatt scale power plants, which is capable of producing around enough power for around 1 million people or so. You've then got, what's called the small reactors, which is typically around 300 megawatts or less. And those reactors are being talked about a lot. There's also then micro reactors, which are into, the singular megawatts, and they're more for off-the-grid applications, and they're currently being developed. But particularly at the moment, there's a lot of interest around what's called small modular reactors, which are, these small reactors around 300 megawatts or so. And the benefit of them is that they're currently being developed to be factory produced. And that the idea of that is that it will create economies of scale where these are produced, the cost goes down, there's standardization of design and regulation, which is able to bring costs down and build times down, so there can be a more efficient rollout of nuclear power plants. And there's currently a lot of companies producing them, whether it's Bill Gates's TerraPower with their Natrium reactor, Rolls-Royce with their Rolls-Royce small modular reactor, Westinghouse with their AP300, even GE Hitachi is currently developing one in Darlington, Canada called the BWRX 300. Now, at the same time, China and Russia already have got collectively 3 small modular reactors currently in operation. So these are, viable technologies. A lot of the time, it's just miniaturizations of the current large plants. And the real test to see whether small modular reactors will be viable is seeing whether that factory produced element can actually occur. But there's a lot of promise around them. There's around 80 designs. I think there's more than 80 small modular reactor designs currently being progressed around the world. So there's a lot of interesting things happening in the space, but unfortunately, Australia's got a blanket ban on nuclear power, which restricts us from all of those technologies. And when there's 80 plus designs for small modular reactors out there and available, I think it's really disappointing that we're ignoring the opportunities presented by future technologies like SMRs, and we're simply just ignoring it. I think that's really disappointing and is a huge detriment to our nation.
Can you go into the history of this moratorium or this prohibition on nuclear energy?
So the nuclear prohibitions at a federal level were introduced in the late 1990s, actually under the Howard government. Now, I think people actually believe that these were, pieces of good policy where there was a lot of policy work put into them for Australia to come to this position. But in reality, both of them were introduced in a rush as part of political compromises for the GST and also funding for our multi-purpose reactor at Lucas Heights, one of which in the middle of the night was debated for 10 minutes. And these are in the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act and the Radiation Protection Act. So these are two pieces of legislation which I think have really held Australia back. Australians were never asked if they wanted nuclear power to be banned. It was debated quickly. They were both political compromises, but it's caused a lot of damage. Australia is the only top 20 economy in the world with a ban on nuclear power. We've got some of the most archaic restrictions on nuclear power in the entire world. You can't really find a country like Australia which has got, in addition to nuclear power bans over the reprocessing of uranium, all of these different facets of the fuel cycle. But in addition to that, we've also got state and territory bans. So, for instance, there's nuclear power bans in Queensland, Victoria, I'm pretty sure New South Wales. There's also a whole host of uranium mining bans, which is really quite confusing, whether that be in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria. So there's a lot.
We can't even mine uranium, let alone export it? Or we
So
do?
in South Australia, you can, and that's one of the few exceptions because they've got a lot of uranium at Olympic Dam, which is managed by BHP. But in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, there are currently uranium mining bans. Also Western Australia also has a uranium mining ban. So we're really not taking advantage of, our natural assets in uranium. And I think the important thing is that, we hear a lot of language around Australia being able to help the rest of the world decarbonise. And, without even considering whether nuclear power should have a role in our grid, surely we would be in a position to be able to export this clean uranium fuel to help other countries decarbonise with nuclear power, help other countries who have a short supply of uranium, such as the United States, for instance, which currently is having to transition away from a Russian uranium supply. So I think it's really disappointing that we've got this huge natural advantage in Australia. We've got a third of the world's uranium, the largest reserves in the world, but currently we're only the fourth largest exporter, and that's because we're not taking advantage of the uranium we've actually got in the ground because of these, really ideological prohibitions we've got in addition to the nuclear power bans.
So you've described uranium as clean. Can you explain how it's clean compared to other energies?
Yeah. So nuclear power is the cleanest energy source. When you look at its emissions footprint over the life cycle of the generating asset, it's the cleanest form of power, and that includes the mining and extraction of uranium. Now, I think it's really important to say that no energy source has a zero footprint on the environment. Like renewables also have an environmental footprint. Fossil fuels obviously also have an environmental footprint. But when all of those different environmental impacts have been levelized, it shows that nuclear is one of the cleanest energy sources, certainly for the environment. A lot of people will look at a nuclear power plant and they'll look at the cooling towers and think that there's smoke coming out of them. But what a lot of people don't realize is that's actually just water vapor, which is being released as part of the process to, actually produce the electricity, as would be done in any kind of thermal power plant, including a coal plant where they've got cooling towers. So there's a lot of misinformation around nuclear power, but the important thing is, if we want to be able to combat climate change, nuclear power is one of the best solutions because it has the lowest emissions over its life cycle, but also the fact that it has such a low environmental footprint, whether it's with land impact, where it requires significantly less land than any energy source, requires significantly less mining than any energy source, and produces significantly less waste than any energy source. And if you look at nuclear power's actual impact on combating climate change around the world, approximately each year, the nuclear power plant's savings in carbon emissions are equivalent to taking around 400 million cars off the road. And nuclear
Wow.
power across history has saved the world from approximately 2 years of average emissions. So nuclear power has done an enormous part in combating climate change. If you look at, for instance, the US, nuclear power contributes to around half of their clean energy. So it does more than a lot of technologies in combating climate change. In many ways, it has done more to combat climate change than solar panels and wind turbines worldwide. So when we think about climate solutions, it's really important that we're not ignoring something like clean nuclear energy.
So, uranium does need to be mined. It's a finite resource. Just how much uranium do we have? How many years of uranium do we have in Australia?
So like many resources, we've got, there's a finite supply. The important thing with nuclear power, and many people will, bring up the point that it's not renewable, and that's to a certain extent true. There's around 300 years of uranium supply at current rates available around the world. The important thing is, though, that there's a lot of different ways that fuel can be sourced for nuclear power stations. One of those ways is that the uranium fuel can actually be reprocessed or recycled, which means that that power, which is contained in that uranium, which isn't used, when the fuel is actually first used in the nuclear power plant, it's still got around 90% of its energy still contained in that fuel, even after its first use. Now, naturally,
90%.
90%. So normally that fuel is immediately considered as waste. But in some countries, they currently recycle it to be able to draw out that power to use it again and again and again, which means that that is a more sustainable way to be able to be sourcing uranium. So, for example, France gets 10% of their power from recycled nuclear fuel. They recycle all of their nuclear fuel. The other interesting thing is Australia, with our multi-purpose reactor, the used fuel from that multi-purpose reactor is currently sent to France to be recycled, and France is therefore able to generate power from our recycled fuel. We then get back the waste products from that. But the important thing is Australia already technically recycles nuclear fuel, so it's an option available to us. In addition to that, there's also the fact that uranium can be taken out of the ocean. I think there's approximately 4,000 times more uranium concentrated in the ocean than there is terrestrially on land. So that's another option. And then there's also other options like thorium, which exist. Australia also has a lot of thorium. So there's a lot of options available to us, which mean that, nuclear can be a sustainable option for us. But at the same time, I'd raise the point that no energy source is truly renewable. Solar panels, the resources which go into producing them, they, are certainly not renewable. There's a lot of hope that, solar panels and wind turbines will be recycled, but the majority of the time they're not. And certainly when you look at fossil fuels, there's no way really to recycle coal once it's burnt in the way that, used nuclear fuel is recycled. And then at the same time, you've got all of those, there's a whole host of issues with fossil fuels. I think the important thing is that, nuclear is incredibly energy dense. So a single pellet of uranium produces as much energy as a ton of coal. And this pellet that I'm talking about, can be the size of my fingernail or like a gummy bear. So it's incredibly energy dense. It doesn't require much fuel, but there is obviously a finite supply of uranium, but there are a lot of other options when we look to the long term, well beyond our lifetimes. At the same time, so I would also mention that, there's also nuclear fusion and other technologies which will surely emerge well past, when we're both alive, which will probably, become, newer technologies which society will be attracted to, which will sort of hopefully, render nuclear power obsolete. So when I look at it, nuclear is incredibly viable for Australia. There aren't any concerns about whether we've got enough uranium, but in the long term, there are other technologies like fusion, but also the ability to, reprocess uranium, use thorium, get uranium out of the ocean, which are also options available to future generations.
Could you give a brief explanation of nuclear fusion?
Yeah. So nuclear fission, which is currently used in nuclear power plants worldwide, is the process of splitting atoms. And that creates a lot of heat, which can then be tapped to, produce electricity or just be used to create process heat. Nuclear fusion, on the other hand, is the merging of atoms using different elements, including helium and others, in next generation power plants. Now, there's a lot of research and development at the moment. Nuclear fusion isn't at a commercial scale, but there's a lot of progress, which I think is really important to watch. Now, the important thing is Australia is actually already contributing to some of that research. We're involved in the ITER project in France, where they're producing an experimental fusion reactor. So that's an international collaboration with a lot of countries developing, I think it's like a $20 billion fusion reactor. But at the same time, there's other innovations in Australia, different companies, startups looking at fusion. There's also at UNSW, they've got a project called Atomcraft, which is a student-led fusion reactor. So there's a lot of interesting things, but at the time being, fusion is still, many would predict, a few decades off from being a commercially viable way of producing electricity at mass. So at the moment, the most important thing for us to focus on is the fission nuclear power plants, which we've currently got, using the uranium we've currently got available, waiting for those fusion technologies to actually be available to us.
The coalition promised that they will lift state and federal bans on nuclear energy. Why do you think Labor refuse nuclear energy outright?
It makes very little sense to me, because when I think about what the Labor movement represents, it's about workers, it's got all the unions involved. When you look around the world, some of the biggest proponents of nuclear are the unions, such as in the UK or in the US. And when I visit nuclear power plants, there's union stickers everywhere, because nuclear power plant jobs are high paying. On average in the US, a nuclear job has 50% higher pay than any other energy industry. It's got the most jobs per unit of electricity of any other energy source. So it really makes little sense. And unfortunately, I think it's because there's been an ideological opposition to the word nuclear. There's been a taboo in the Labor movement in Australia for a long time, which goes back to, the Vietnam War and to the weapons testing which occurred in Australia's history. But obviously that's not connected to civil nuclear power. So I think it's really disappointing, because when you look around the world, there is bipartisanship on nuclear power. Like, for instance, in the UK, where their politics is very divided, both UK Labor and the Conservative Party are very strong supporters of nuclear power. In fact, Keir Starmer recently has made announcements indicating that he wants to lift the red tape in the way of nuclear power and invest in more nuclear power. They've also signed up to a global pledge to triple nuclear power globally, the same as the US, where under both the Biden administration, now the Trump administration, both of those political parties, despite being so politically divided and pretty much disagreeing on every single political issue, also both support nuclear power strongly. For instance, the US Energy Secretary has been declaring that he wants to see a global nuclear renaissance, and certainly a nuclear renaissance in the US. But in addition to that, he's actually specifically called on Australia to consider the role of nuclear power in our grid. So it's really disappointing and frankly just a bit odd why there is such an opposition from our Labor movement here in Australia to nuclear power, because it's certainly not consistent with the rest of the world. There are Greens parties, for instance, in Finland who support nuclear power. Nuclear power is a solution which can tick pretty much anyone's box, whether it's, lowering power bills, keeping the lights on, keeping industry going, keeping, energy workers employed with high paying unionized jobs, whether it's, lowering emissions. It should theoretically, and, also protecting the environment, it should theoretically tick everyone's boxes. So it's kind of weird seeing such an ideological fear campaign being, executed against nuclear power at the moment in Australia. It just doesn't stack up. There'll have to be an inevitable flip at some stage. It's just when.
Yeah, it's a shame that it's such a partisan issue. I have a few more lefty friends who straight away deride any talk of nuclear as, oh, that's something Peter Dutton wants to do, and therefore, because it's connected to Peter Dutton, they automatically discount it without actually knowing about the science. So the conversation devolves into tribal politics and less about the science, which I think is such a shame.
And the funny thing is, say in the UK, it was UK Labor who initially were the ones proposing nuclear power, not the Conservatives. So it doesn't really make much sense, especially when you've got a technology which is, perfectly placed to lower emissions and protect the environment, why it would immediately be associated with conservative politics. And I think that's been a real issue in Australia. Is it has, like you said, become so partisanized, and it's made it such a toxic environment to discuss nuclear power. There's been so much disinformation from our politicians. So it's a really ugly debate at the moment. Like, I talk to some of my friends who are, nuclear experts and nuclear advocates in other countries, and they look at Australia in shock. Even when I talk to world leaders, when I've been to climate conferences and other events, there's been a real confusion about Australia's position. For instance, when I was at COP28, I had the chance to interview Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and he called on Australia to lift the ban on nuclear power, saying it was necessary if we wanted to reach net zero. And at the same time, there's a whole host of other leaders which have also, shaken their heads at Australia, whether it was, with the US and UK at COP29 approaching Australia, believing that we would want to enter the Gen 4 agreement to knowledge share on nuclear technologies. And Australia simply walked away from that. That was headline news because Australia was ignoring this, this offering from the US and UK to collaborate. And that was purely for political reasons. Leaders from around the world would be shaking their heads at Australia with our position. We've got the nuclear submarines, but we're not even willing to consider civil nuclear power. It simply makes no sense.
You're a busy man, especially coming into the election, although I know Nuclear for Australia is completely nonpartisan, and I really appreciate that. Could you compare the two energy policies that Labor and the Coalition are proposing?
So obviously, like you said, Nuclear for Australia is nonpartisan. We haven't endorsed the coalition policy. We think it's important that, there is able to be a group which can criticise any energy policy which is presented. Would certainly be very encouraged if the Labor Party or any other party put up a nuclear power policy for scrutiny to be able to have more options for the Australian public. But at the moment, there's a, unfortunate situation where it's currently only the coalition which have got their nuclear policy, which is to install, I'm pretty sure it's 14 gigawatts of nuclear into the grid alongside renewables and also gas to be able to get to net zero by 2050. And they predict that nuclear power will lower costs by 25% in both of the progressive and step change scenario, which are modelled under the Integrated Systems Plan by the Australian. Yep.
Sorry. Do we know where they propose these reactors will be?
Yeah. So these power plants have been proposed in locations where current existing coal-fired power plants are, or coal-fired power plants which have recently exited the grid, for instance, in Port Augusta. So the specific locations are in Collie in Western Australia. You've then got Callide, which is near Rockhampton, Billawheeler. In Queensland, you've got Tarong. In Queensland, there's also the Hunter, Lithgow, Latrobe Valley, and then you've also got Port Augusta. Hopefully I haven't forgotten one. But these are all coal communities where there's high energy literacy, there's existing transmission infrastructure, there's existing water supplies. So that's currently the coalition's logic, that they'll be able to, if there's coal plants still operating there, that they'll be able to, be shut down, and then a nuclear power plant will be able to be built.
Have other countries done this?
So there's a lot of interest at the moment from other countries. For instance, the US is currently exploring this, and there's a small modular reactor being produced by Bill Gates in Wyoming at the location of a coal-fired power plant. And there's a huge range of promises from this. For instance, the US Department of Energy has determined that there could be a 35% construction cost saving when using the site of an existing coal-fired power station. And that makes sense because you've got, the industry experience in those areas, you've got industry set up, you've also got the existing transmission infrastructure, other kinds of infrastructure which would be needed to support a nuclear power plant. So there's a lot of benefits from being able to do something like that. And also, obviously, water is important because if you've got that water supply, that's really important for a nuclear power plant, assuming that, you are using water cooling and not dry cooling. So that's currently what they're proposing for Australia. On the other hand, the Labor Party is proposing currently an 82% renewable goal, which there's actually been recent research which has found that They're currently 17% short of reaching that by 2030. So that's currently not on track, with the goal to be able to transition Australia to, pretty much 100% renewables in the longer term, using along the way solutions including green hydrogen, gas peaking, batteries, pumped hydro, which, as we discussed at the start, are, very complex solutions. And certainly when you look at stuff like green hydrogen, which the current plans are relying on, that's shown in many examples that it's not viable. And it's concerning now that Australia's energy transition is so reliant on things like that, which has shown so many problems with commercialisation in Australia and around the world.
Is any country 100% renewable?
Certainly not at the scale Australia is. Certainly there's no country which is getting 100% of its energy from renewables. There would be smaller countries who would be able to claim that they're getting their power from 100% renewables, but a lot of the time that includes hydro. Now, Australia, it doesn't use hydro at scale because of environmental issues in the past. There's obviously been lots of protests around hydro. So that's not really an option Australia has. When you look around the world to the countries which have actually made meaningful efforts in decarbonisation, they've either got a lot of hydro or a lot of nuclear. Now, if Australia is not going to consider hydro, we should be considering nuclear. For instance, you look at France, around 100% of their grid at the moment comes from clean power. And that's from a combination of around 65% nuclear and then the rest mainly made up of renewables and then some gas as well. So that's, I think, something that we should really draw inspiration from, is a balanced energy mix, such as the one they've got in France. But there's a whole host of other examples. The real issue is the intermittent sources of renewable energy like solar panels, wind turbines, because obviously hydro is renewable, but it doesn't really rely on the weather. It can provide that reliable power that nuclear can, but there really isn't any country which has gone to 100% solar and wind like Australia is trying to do on weather-dependent energy sources.
And is there any movement within the Labor Party that's pushing for nuclear?
Well, certainly there are some unions which have been pro-nuclear, such as the Australian Workers' Union, with their former secretary, Dan Walton, was very pro-nuclear. There's a lot of other proponents in the Labor movement, such as Joel Fitzgibbons, former Defence Minister.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some other Labor leaders like Jenny George and others like Bob Hawke, which for a long time were advocating for nuclear power as an essential part of Australia's mix. So there's certainly... it's not a blanket position of the Labor movement to be anti-nuclear. I obviously know a lot of people in the Labor movement who are pro-nuclear and are really dismayed by the anti-nuclear attacks which are going on at the moment in the fear campaigns. But I think there will be progress inevitably. I think especially with the younger generation, young people are more likely to support nuclear power. They're more likely to have an open mind, to understand that a lot of the fear-mongering about waste and safety just simply doesn't stack up. So I think there will hopefully be a lot of progress in that domain. I obviously hope that there will be bipartisanship on nuclear in Australia, because at the end of the day, it will be very difficult to build nuclear power plants in Australia if there is still this toxic political environment around it. We've got short terms of, around 3 years for our current politicians serving. So even if the coalition was to get in, there's also a chance that, they could then be voted out, and any progress that they made on nuclear power would be erased if the Labor Party was still anti-nuclear. So that's a real priority of ours, and why it's so important that an organisation like Nuclear for Australia is non-partisan is because we really think there's a huge importance to bipartisanship. And we certainly think it's possible, because when you look around the world, there is bipartisanship. There isn't now a question if you ask the Democrats or UK Labor, they wouldn't question their support for nuclear power. So it's something that I really hope that we can see in Australia soon.
Great. Yeah, if people want to learn more about Nuclear for Australia or the very important work that you do, where should they go?
So Nuclear for Australia's got presence on every single social media platform, so obviously follow along there. But in addition to that, you can head to Nuclear for Australia's website at nuclearforaustralia.com, where we've got more facts and fact sheets about nuclear power. We've also got the ability to sign up to our petition to lift the ban on nuclear power, and you can also make a contribution if you want to support our work.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Will.
Thanks, Zoe.